All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get kicked off. We've already had one question asked, but for anyone who has questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A button that you see along the Zoom controls. We do hope to have some time for Q&A at the end, but any questions we don't get to, we will send out email responses to. So definitely get in your questions, even if we don't have a ton of time at the end, we will get you responses. And the recording and the slides will be available after the event. So let's get going. Real briefly, just who we are. So Michelle and I both work for MedSec. So we're basically a healthcare and medical device cybersecurity firm. So we do both consulting services, we have a product, we work across the ecosystem with the full life cycle of the medical devices. And I think that's what gives us a really unique perspective to work with devices that are both in design and then also fielded in clinical use. And then when they're end of life, we're involved in a lot of working groups, standards. If it has to do with med device cybersecurity, there's probably someone from MedSec on there, and we're really proud of that. We really do believe in being part of the industry. So that's sort of who we are. Specifically, my name's Stephanie. I'm our Executive Vice President. I'm going to take you through the first half of the presentation. Forewarning, it's definitely a bit of a boot camp. I'm going to throw stuff at you really fast. We have an hour, and I want to get a lot of information. So Michelle will do the last half, and it's a boot camp, so remember the recording's there if it goes too fast. All right, so threat modeling background. So what is it and why is it important? So just to level set, the whole idea of threat modeling is that you are going to go through a process of looking at theoretical harm to a system. And why threat modeling is so important to get right is this structured activity, right? You're trying to make it structured. You're trying to make it that you have a methodology that you know is giving you good information. There is no shortage of ways to do threat modeling, but our goal is how do we model the theoretical threats against the system in a structured way? Okay, that sounds great, but why is it actually important? So it's important for a multitude of reasons. So hands down, designing security through the life cycle of your medical device is critical, and threat modeling helps be that input into some of the early stages of some critical design decisions. If you understand the threat landscape of your device, it's easier to make some of those critical design decisions. It is hands down essential for security risk management. If you follow TIR 57, some derivative of it, or you've built your own in-house system, regardless of what you do, I would lay the claim that threat modeling is a foundational piece of your security risk management, and that you would struggle to do security risk management well if you don't do threat modeling. There's the ability to drive abuse cases and ensure coverage into your security testing. And it is very commonly requested in FDA submissions. We work with a lot of customers who are working on their submissions, and I can tell you this is a very, very common ask that if you do not provide them with a threat model, they are going to ask you for a threat model. So very commonly asked for. The FDA, however, does not define exactly what you need to do. They basically want to see that you've done something that passes muster. And so we're going to talk to you about some techniques that are industry respected, but then more importantly, how you actually use that integrated into your regulated process. The threat modeling and development life cycle. So how to do it and where does it fit? So first we have to level set on when do you actually do threat modeling. And I'm going to talk about these three documents. So just so you know, if you're into Google fooling later, these are three documents that you should absolutely look up if you're trying to get your hands around med device cybersecurity and threat modeling specifically. Definitely grab these three. I'm going to make references to them. So first, we're going to start by looking at sort of the full product life cycle as it pertains to cybersecurity. So this diagram is lifted from the JSP, which was the first link on my previous slide. And so what you're seeing is it's basically laying out what are all the pieces that you should be doing for cybersecurity in your medical devices life cycle. And what we're going to talk about is where threat modeling fits in. The threat modeling is a piece of this product security risk assessment. So it starts at concept phase and extends, sort of throughout the process. But we're going to talk about, so what is the product security risk assessment? That's where I'm going to start to lean on AAMI TIR 57. So if you're trying to drill down more, and so what should I do for security risk management? That's where AAMI TIR 57 is the go-to that I would recommend. So if you look through AAMI TIR 57, you will find this diagram, which is a very heavily referenced diagram. And the whole goal here was to set up that security risk management is parallel to your safety risk management, ISO 14971 process. And the piece where threat modeling lies is in the security risk analysis. So you see, if you're starting really early in the life cycle, threat modeling should actually be pretty early in the activities that you're doing from a cybersecurity perspective. So inside of that security risk analysis piece, if you dig farther into AMI-TIR 57, you'll find a definition here. So they're expanding here, and what you can see is this identification of threats, vulnerabilities, assets, and adverse impacts. So that's where threat modeling comes in. So this diagram kind of blows that up, and you can see here's this identify threat sources and events. So the whole idea here is that threat modeling is a piece of a much larger cybersecurity risk assessment process. But if you're trying to figure out, where in the larger minutia is it, I'm proposing this is where it is. It's in that security risk analysis piece, and it's in this identify threat sources and events. So it's an expansion of your security risk analysis. For those familiar with things like FMEAs, you may find some commonality with these, but they're with a cybersecurity perspective. But even though it's done early on in the life cycle, ideally, it's one of these organic documents that keeps growing and living with the system. So once we say we have this box, right, we know sort of when we threat model, then the activity of actually doing it comes up. So we're going to talk briefly about some techniques for approaching actually doing threat modeling. So inside of AMI-TIR 57, what you'll find is there's a couple different high-level approaches. I will be the first to say that there is quite literally an endless number of methodologies out there for doing threat modeling. There is no shortage of them. Some are better than others, but the idea is that none of them are really wrong, and none of them are really right. None of them are this magic silver bullet that's going to solve the world's threat modeling problems. All of them are just different ways to approach it. So I'm going to talk about some of the pros and cons of some of the different buckets. So the first bucket is what we call an asset-oriented risk assessment. So what you can see with this flow is that you start by thinking about the assets of the system, the impact if something were to happen to them, and then you kind of trace through the vulnerabilities and the threats and eventually leading to risk. So the idea with asset-oriented is I'm starting with really thinking about the assets of the system. A separate one from that is vulnerability oriented. So it's a different way of thinking. I'm thinking about the vulnerabilities in the system and then what threats that might be exploited by those vulnerabilities. So some people might think of this as almost backwards, right? I'm starting with the vulnerabilities in the system and trying to think of what are the threats that are exploited by those vulnerabilities. The third bucket you'll find in AMI-TIR 57 is threat oriented. And this one is all about thinking about the threat sources first, and we'll go into a little more detail of what each of these mean. So, but the idea is, so you start with the threat sources and you're thinking about where do all my threats come from and what is it they might want to do to my system, and that's where your threats originate. So AMI-TIR 97 is then the post-market version of cybersecurity risk management. So where I'm proposing that in threat modeling, I mentioned it's never done, it's an organic document that's always living and breathing. This post-production information, this is where your updating of threat modeling is happening. So AMI-TIR 97 helps you align with your post-market cybersecurity plan. So part of that post-production information should be tying back into and updating your threat model. And if we hop back out to the JSP, what you'll see is the JSP also shows this. So they have on the right-hand side here what you would think of as your traditional post-market processes. And then you see this nice little line that is in fact showing you that all of that connects back and feeds back into your product security risk assessment. So everything you're learning post-market still needs to feed back into and keep that threat model updated because information is constantly changing. So threat modeling process, so that's kind of where it lives in your medical device life cycle. But now we're going to talk about how you do it. So the threat modeling process breaks down into a couple different phases. First, you just have to understand the system and scope. Next, you're going to kind of define sort of your attackers or your assets, right? And we'll talk about how it depends which one of those methodologies you chose. Then you're going to actually document your threats. You're going to rank them in some fashion and decide whether or not you accept them or you need to do something about it. So identifying threats, recall, I mentioned 3 different ones, but I'm going to focus on 2 that are the most prevalent. So the first is this asset-oriented, where you're starting with the assets of the system. And the second is threat source oriented, or just threat oriented, where you're starting with who are the threat actors and what might they want to do to my system. So the number one question I get asked by customers when we start introducing this concept is, well, which one's best, right? Which one should I do? Which one does the FDA want to see? And so I can confidently tell you the FDA accepts both methodologies. It's really just, did you do it well, and did it actually accurately represent the threats to your system? So we'll go through this a little bit, but your actor base, or your threat actor base, tends to concentrate more on probable attacks and system level risk. And you'll see asset-based modeling techniques focus on what is technically possible, but what you'll find is there tends to then be a lot of distracting minutia in them. So both have their pros and cons. That pro of the threat actor is it's much more on realistic threats, and we'll understand that a little bit more in a minute. But some people can say that, well, it doesn't go deep enough because you're focusing more at the system level and not at the asset level. But conversely to that, the asset-based approaches, you find sometimes you end up so much in the minutia that you have 500 threats from a relatively simple system, with all of them being technically possible, but highly, highly improbable, that you're spending time on a lot of distraction. So threat modeling methods. So I mentioned the asset-based first. We'll go through a couple here. And I also mentioned before, there is never an end to the number of methodologies out there. I'm going to introduce to you what I feel are the two best asset-based models. And by best, I mean the ones that I have seen really drive impact to medical devices successfully. And so there are other methodologies out there. If you use one that's not one of these, that's completely okay, as long as it's driving value for your design process. So the first one is starting with something called a data flow diagram. Recall, asset-based is all about figuring out the assets of the system, and so you have to do that in some kind of methodical way. So data flow diagrams, you'll often hear them just called DFDs, is a way of getting all of those assets on paper. So the idea is you're building a representation of where data goes, where it's stored, and how it's used. There's a few just sort of known symbols, and you're using arrow flows. The whole idea is that you're representing where data goes and where it's used, because at the end of the day, that's always the thing typically under attack. It's where data is being used, it's where data is being stored, it's where data is being transmitted. Those are the things that have an impact on the system. So data flow diagrams are one of those kind of ubiquitous first steps in asset-oriented to figure out, what are my assets? And then once you have your list of assets, asset-oriented is this idea that you go through each of the assets with some structured methodology to figure out, well, what are the threats against each asset? So that's where you get things like STRIDE. So this is the most industry-leading one. If you were to just Google threat modeling methodologies, I guarantee this is probably the top one that would pop up. So it's very popular. It was built by Microsoft, and it's a methodology for basically going through each one of your assets and asking, does it have a spoofing threat? Does it have a tampering threat? Does it have a repudiation threat? So because of that, it helps give confidence you have really, really good coverage. So what you'll find is it has the ability to have really overly detailed information. So it's great at visualization. It's a solid starting point. It's one of those most mature methods. And because it's so methodical, you have that confidence that you've got really great coverage in your model, because you literally went through every single asset. Sometimes classifications on the con side can lead to some confusion, especially things like escalation of privilege may imply spoofing, which may imply another. You miss what I call chains of threats, where threats are very much attached to one another, but there's no good representation, or there's no easy way to represent chains in something like STRIDE. And the other one, the one where we have clients struggle the most, is just it's overly detailed. A very simple system may end up with 500 STRIDE threats, and that's just really a lot of juggle, when a lot of them are technically feasible, but highly hypothetical. And so that's where I see most people struggle who try to use STRIDE. Another asset-oriented method is called attack trees. So I'm actually a huge fan of attack trees. Michelle will talk about them later. I love them and adore them. Attack trees are asset-oriented in the sense that you are starting with a root asset of the system. And the idea is then you iterate over all the different steps that someone might do to get at that asset, creating basically a tree. So what you end up with something like this, where you've got a root threat at the base of it, and then after that, you've got basically all of the different steps. So why I like this is because I mentioned in STRIDE, it's really hard to show chains of threats. And that's where a lot of people have struggles with it, is because when you think of attack patterns and attacks that someone might carry out, it's never just one thing in isolation. It's always they do this, and that enables them to do this, and that enables them to do this. So that's what attack trees are for. Attack trees are for taking those more complex threats and modeling them in such a way so you can see those chains. So attack tree pros and cons, highly methodical, highly structured. It's really helpful to show really quick attack types so you can quickly trace how an attack would go from beginning to end. Where people struggle with attack trees is on completeness. You can feel like, well, I could add 100 nodes, I could add 5 nodes, feeling like, have you added enough nodes? That ties into scoping, where it's tough to know whether or not you scoped it broad enough and sort of what the attack tree means. And so this is one where I would say this one has a really big impact if done correctly. It's a little harder to approach, but people who have done it, clients we've helped with this, have found it so immensely impactful to see those chains of attacks. And understand, you know, I'm trying to equip you with things to basically Google afterwards or talk to me afterwards. I love threat modeling, so I'm not going to talk about how you do an attack tree because we have a lot to cover. But I wanted to give you the idea that if you're trying to figure out what to do, definitely look at attack trees. Threat actor is the other type of threat modeling that I spoke about. And so threat actor is all about starting with who are your threat sources, right? Who are the people who are even bringing threats to your device? And so it starts with less about your device itself and more just about like the environment that it's going to be in. What risk does it represent? And so you're starting with who are the threat actors. This is a list. I can't actually remember which guidance document. One of the NIST guidance documents, I think, is where this list is from. The idea is basically you walk through who are various threat sources and basically just ask yourself, what would a nation state want to do against my device? And you write those threats down. Now, there is this idea of something called a threat actor library, a TAL, and I apologize, this is TAL, that's an L. So TAL means threat actor library. And so this is an idea that people who are doing threat actor modeling build this list of who are the adversaries that you should be concerned about in a certain sector or for a certain manufacturer. So what you see I have on the screen here is one that was developed by Intel specifically for healthcare. So I gave you, if you're trying to find this document, great document about threat modeling in healthcare using this threat actor library. This is what you're going to put into Google to find the PDF. So it's built by Intel, and they basically built this actor. Here's all the threat actors that they perceive to be in healthcare, and this is how they do their threat modeling against their healthcare-based systems. And so I realize it's an eye chart. I want you to download the document and look through it, ask me questions. But the idea here is just, these are all the actors I need to be concerned about. This is where threats come from. So focuses more on realistic threats is the biggest pro of threat actor. You're really looking at what are the actual things you need to be concerned about. But some people kind of qualm that, well, it doesn't get into the in-depth of my system, right? It doesn't look at the minutia of the fact that I have a CAN bus, right? Because it's more about who are the actual actors. But understand it's also okay to mix and match. You can have really powerful outcomes when you mix and match this stuff. So something called, if you download that Intel document, what you'll find is they talk about something called a threat actor aware risk assessment, where you can use things like this threat actor TAL to actually help with other types of threat modeling. So if you're not completely on board with threat actor modeling in and of itself, and you want to maybe augment your stride, you can totally do that. You will find so much value from mixing and matching the methodologies. So understand it doesn't have to be black and white. You don't have to do only stride or only attack trees or only threat actor. You can get a lot of great value from mixing them. So after you've got your list of threats, the next step is always, how do I rank them? You're going to have potentially a lot of threats. You have to have some way of figuring out which ones do you care about. So I won't go into too much detail here other than just to give you a few different ideas. The number one leading methodology I see is things like CVSS. So CVSS version 3 specifically, there's 2 versions of that. So there's the base standards. If you were to Google CVSS version 3, you would get to first.org, who runs that standard. There was an effort by MITRE, a number of us, MedSec included, was on the working group to develop a medical device specific version of CVSS 3, version 3. So I absolutely love that. It takes a lot of the weird IT steal out of the original standard and very much translates it to the medical device space. At the end of the day, what you do get is a CVSS version 3 score, so it's nice to still speak that universal language. OWASP has a security ranking methodology that I'm actually a big fan of because it brings in business risk if that were to happen. So it's not just about the technical risk. The OWASP actually has business risk and business impact as a piece of their ranking algorithm. And then there's the straight up severity and likelihood, which is what most people are accustomed to from a safety risk management standpoint. So this one I still see a lot because it's the most organic translation. And this can still absolutely work if done correctly. So these are all ones that I've seen be successful. Again, there's a million methodologies out there. If you're doing something that's not on this list and it's working for you, awesome. But these are ones that I see a lot be successful and drive value. So next is acceptability of threats. At some point you have to draw, where is that line in the sand, right? Where am I deciding this is acceptable or this is something I need to do something about? So once you've got that list of threats, how do you decide what needs fixed, right? As with safety, it's a risk-based decision, right? There is no required level of vulnerabilities for you to fix or threats for you to tackle. It's risk management based. So the biggest decision you will have to make as a company is whether or not harm is part of your acceptability. And this one always gets a lot of like weird looks when I first propose this to people, because from a safety risk management perspective, they're so accustomed that everything traces back to harm. And actually my recommended approach is security does not. But so the big question here, the big fork in the road, is cybersecurity threats that pose a potential patient safety risk must be considered. I am not under any circumstances saying you don't consider them, but the idea is their impact to patient safety something you consider in your cybersecurity ranking, or do you hand them over to safety risk management and let them handle the safety aspect of it? So acceptability with harm, this should look very familiar, right? At the top, you've got something cybersecurity related. In this case, I'm calling it exploitability. And you've got your heat map that is then matching that with severity of harm, right? So you're doing something that incorporates harm, or maybe it's severity and likelihood and harm is a part of severity. But the idea is you are somehow heat mapping it with something that drives back to safety. And so people who follow this course, it's usually organically because that's how they do safety risk management, or they tend to reference this diagram from the FDA post-market guidance, page 15. And so this diagram that was in that guidance document shows basically this heat map of exploitability hashed with patient harm on the top. And so people who follow this route tend to reference this document. And so it's not a wrong way to go. I would say since this guidance document came out that what works and what drives the most impact has evolved. So what we've seen work and drive more value is a separation of the two. And so that separation of the two means you still can have things like heat maps, right? You still have something like maybe exploitability or impact across the top, but the idea is what you're hashing that with is something that does not have any root harm associated with it. So maybe it's business impact, it's data security represented, like the risk to the hospital, right? It's number of devices affected, right? Does this threat affect one device in the fleet, or is it a fleet-wide threat? So the idea is you're still hashing it with some kind of a severity, but that severity has no piece of patient harm associated with it. And this methodology, for people who tend to follow this one, it derives from Amy TIR 57, where the whole idea with this was that security is kept very separate but parallel to your 14971 safety process. And you see these little arrows here that show you that anything with a safety risk is brought over to safety for analysis. So you're not analyzing safety risks in your security process, they're going to safety. And then same with controls. So any controls you put in place get analyzed for their safety impact. But the idea is completely separate measuring sticks. Security is not a piece of it. And so bringing this out just from 80,001, talking about harm and sort of showing that there is an overlap, right? There is security risk that does have and poses a harm risk to devices. So there is some need to tie it in with your safety risk management. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of security risk that has nothing to do with patient harm. And you want to make sure that you're measuring with a security stick all of your security risks, and leave safety to those processes that are ingrained with safety, and not try to have weird redundant processes that have to overlap with each other. And so that was my fire hose about kind of how you do threat modeling. I'm going to hand it off to Michelle, who's now going to talk about how you use your threat model to drive value. And we're going to switch screen share, so 1 second.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephanie. All right. Well, now that you've gotten a chance to take a look at kind of the nuts and bolts of how threat modeling works, we're now going to jump into the utility of threat models, which is my area of expertise. I spend a lot of my time here at MedSec trying to help strategize regulatory submissions from a cybersecurity perspective. So that's where we're actually going to talk about on my part of the discussion today. So when I think about threat models, completely agree with everything that Stephanie says. I don't build threat models. I use them as a source of information for creating a good, solid argument that you've done your job with risk management. So when I think about threat modeling, I think of some key things that are used by threat models are used for to help create that evidence. So some important things when you're thinking about threat modeling and creating threat models is that when you're identifying threats, this should be based on the overall system architecture. This is really important so you get that idea that you're getting the thoroughness of the treatment of the overall threat model and the system. Another important part here is also assessing each use case, right? So every medical device has a job to do, right? It has an intended use, it performs that intended use. But there's all kinds of other things like the way that you update the software, patch the software, other things that are having sorry, I'm just looking at there's a note here about Stephanie, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not seeing screen flashing. Is anyone else seeing that?
Okay.
I'm not seeing it.
Okay, very good. So not only is it important you look at the entire system architecture as an overall whole, but it's also important to not just look at what the device's day job is, but also when it goes to the corner store and it does things that are part of its use, but not necessarily part of the primary job. Because sometimes what we see is that threats can emerge through kind of those side activities of maintenance and other things that we want to make sure that we're capturing in the threat model. And that again gives us that concept of thoroughness, that you've looked at everything. So if we're able to apply all that, you can better make that argument that you have hit every point. So this first section is really, how do you use threat modeling to augment your regulatory strategy for submissions that are relevant to cybersecurity? And I think most people who've had experience with submissions or even working in a regulated space know that risk management is a huge part of any submission toolbox, any audit. Risk management is really where you're doing a lot of really important work, where there's a lot of focus. What I like about threat models is that I think they help tell a story, right? Good threat models are loaded with visuals. They have diagrams understanding how data flows and what ports are functioning, what's going across those ports. And you can, a well-designed threat model can tell a story in a way that a risk assessment never can, right? Most risk assessments are in the structure of a spreadsheet. You can read the spreadsheet, but you don't necessarily always get the full picture. But when you're using things like, Stephanie was talking about Stride, there's also a number of other models that you can use to help not only identify threats, but evaluate threats, DREAD, PASTA, TRIKE. You can get a good confidence that you have a good structured approach for evaluating the system and telling that story about how you looked at the system and that you felt that you've gotten all of those threats appropriately. Another part that's important around threat modeling is it helps you make this science-based justification for how you've designed your device and how you set up those controls. The evidence that you can walk through step by step, you go through each of those interfaces, you go through each of these important points, you go through each of the assets. It's a very structured walkthrough of the system so that you feel like you've gone through and really made a good evidence-based assessment of your system. Sometimes it's harder with risk management, right? Because you know, a lot of people do their risk management through brainstorming activities, but a well-structured threat model can really put a lot of emphasis on the fact that you've done that thorough and complete step-by-step approach through the system. A lot of times, you know, there's always the dreaded question from FDA. You're asking for explanation or deficiency around what they saw in your risk management file. And I feel like a lot of times, the reason that the question comes up is that you maybe didn't explain yourself completely, or it wasn't clear by the simple language in a risk assessment about how you thought about your controls and how you address that threat and whether it's sufficient. So if it's not clear, they're going to typically ask about it, end of story. So your goal, and my goal to get across to you during this presentation, is tell a better story, you'll get a better outcome. So I think threat models, and like I said, I don't make them, I don't create threat models, but I use them regularly to help explain the structured argument for how a particular risk assessment was done and a system was evaluated. There's a couple of ways that you can use threat models in a submission. One is proactively, right? If you have a good threat model, good data flow diagrams, a very organized structure, front matter, it can really help the FDA understand how your system works, how the information flows across access points, and overall, all the different things that your system will do that they won't get really in any other thing that you create within your submission. They're not going to get it in other parts of of course, you have a device description, but the device description is not telling you the same kind of things that good front matter of a threat model will tell you from those data flow diagrams and explanations of how things are passing through the system and how things are connected. And as Stephanie mentioned, I am a huge fan of attack trees because I think that they really help not only the FDA understand how you've mapped complex attack scenarios, but I also think they help your teams, right? A lot of teams are used to using things like fault trees and other kinds of methodologies that help you break down complex situations, which is why I think that attack trees for medical device folks is actually a really helpful thing to add because it aligns with that thinking process that you might have for evaluating complex risk scenarios. The other thing that is really important to help reduce questions from the beginning and being proactive and telling that better story is making sure you have good traceability between your threat model and your risk management. This helps FDA understand how you've surfaced threats and identified them through the threat model, and then you've assessed them and closed them if necessary in your risk management file. So if you do a threat model and it stands alone, and you do a risk management file and it stands alone, you're not really utilizing the threat model as it was intended, which is supposed to be a feed into the risks that you're identifying within the risk management. Another thing here that helps tell that good story, being proactive and helping reduce the chance of questions, is a good security executive summary. Highlight the notable issues that arose from the threat model or the pen test, whatever you're using to feed in that new risk. And, if you're, this is something I often tell, folks that I'm working with, if your team spent more than a single meeting talking about a particular risk that's in your risk assessment or a threat that's in your threat model and trying to figure out how you're going to deal with it or how you should rank it, that's probably a good candidate for explaining how you've addressed that risk or threat in your executive summary so that they can understand your thinking too. If they weren't in that room. So the overall goal is a carefully organized presentation of your information can give confidence to the reviewer and reduce skepticism. Also helps them find their own answers if you're organized and structured, and it's clear that you've put a good thought through the process, and also that you've been methodical in it. Okay, so best laid plans, you told a good story, but you still had questions, right? So threat models can also be really good for defensive positions, right? If you get questions about, did you really do enough? Like that's a nice control that you've put on that risk, but we're not sure whether that's really enough to say that you've handled it. So threat models can be really good, and particularly, I will say it again, attack trees can be very good in this, because you can step through the logic and explain to FDA through your models and your threat models and your attack trees how you've gotten to where you've gotten, and it can really help ensure that that whole story has been told and that you've been able to communicate everything that you've thought about. One other thing here that I would like to add is a good pen test combined with that threat model and risk management can have a major impact in your ability to not only tell your story, but defend your story. A penetration test or pen test is something that is really important for saying, I had a third party look at my product. They tried to break it, and it took them a lot to break it, right? So like you put in controls and you test whether they're working by having an actual human try to break into your device. So that plus the the theoretical side of the threat model can give you extra emphasis that you've done your job. Just because I like them so much, I'm going to talk a little bit about why attack trees are important. We've talked a little bit about attack trees, but here's a structure of what a sample one would look like. And basically it's just saying, if you've done fault trees or things like that, you'll see the same kind of methodology, right? The top is the threat that you've identified in your threat model. And then you have these child nodes that walk through the different steps in the process. So you can see the sequence and cadence of how this threat may be realized through exploitation. And at the bottom, they're closed with controls. You'll notice that I'm also calling out that you can put IDs in the attack tree. So as you bring the information back into your risk assessment, you can actually use these attack tree codes or IDs to bring the reviewer back and forth through those documents and increase traceability. So I kind of already mentioned this, but the big value that I find in attack trees is that your teams have gotten to the point where they are with a particular risk or threat because they've talked about it, right? But the FDA wasn't in the room when you were having all these discussions. It's the same thing. Like I do a lot of standards, and I know why we wrote certain clauses in a standard because I was in the room. But if you weren't in the room when they were creating that standard and having that discussion about all those specific words that were used in that clause, you won't have the context. So attack trees are great for providing context and detail about what a particularly complex or high risk attack scenario might look like. Again, tell the story, explain it, and give folks the full context when they're looking for something. Okay. So the other part that I wanted to talk about today is integration of threat modeling. As Stephanie well knows, this has been something that's been on my mind a lot lately. I originate more from the security risk management side, spent a lot of time helping to stand up TIR 57, TIR 97, and now SW 96, which is the standardization of TIR 57. So I spent a lot of time both in 14971 risk management and TIR 57 security risk management. So when I first started, working with threat modeling, the first thing I thought was like, okay, how do we connect this to the risk management? Because threat modeling on its own doesn't really do enough. You really have to connect it to the risks. So I think it's pretty easy to see how threat modeling can fit into your risk process, but I'm going to also argue that it belongs in your design feed as well. And we're going to talk through that. So my premise here is to walk through not only how you map it, but also where it should map to, right? So you have your threat model, and it should be mapping into your risk management so you can identify risks and close them. But first, it should probably be mapping into your product design process, because it's much easier to design out these issues than to have to try to control the risks after the design is done. So we're going to talk right now about product design process as connection to threat modeling. Sorry for all the non-regulatory people on the call, but this is 1345, and 1345 says all of your design inputs should come from a few specific places. So threat modeling clearly has that link to an output of risk management. Threat modeling comes in there. But I would also argue that threat modeling done early can be a very good way of feeding into the early design process, where you're looking at how you're actually designing the overall device so that you actually don't have those threats. They're not relevant anymore because you've avoided them through the design rather than through a control. Another aspect of this, sometimes I think prevents people from seeing the connection of using a threat model to feed into design control, is so often when you're thinking of user needs, you're thinking, what does the user want this thing to do? What does the user need my medical device to do for them? But in security, you're focused on what you don't want the system to do, right? For example, you don't want it to allow unauthorized access. So it seems like a little bit of a reverse thought process that you're thinking about what you don't want a system to do versus what you do. But in the end, your design choices really need to be more defensive than functional when you're thinking about it from a security point of view. So when you're thinking about your design, doing early pen testing to help drive your design to prevent that unauthorized access, making good secure choices to reduce opportunities for threat actors, leveraging that threat model for that can really help you design a more robust product that needs fewer controls. So that's my pitch where I think you should feed threat modeling into design. Now we're going to talk a little bit more nitty gritty about how threat modeling pulls into risk management, because that does require some thought. I'm first going to tell you, people can kind of cut the line of what belongs in the threat model and what belongs in the risk management process. You can cut that cloth in several different places. I will tell you that I'll tell you where I believe the cutoff is from my experience and what I do. I feel like the threat model is where you say, when I look at this data flow diagram, how can a threat actor impact this asset, right? Looking at the system level, looking at how things are moving around, looking at the connections, looking at all these different places you could have risks introduced to the system through threat actors. On the risk management side, though, we're looking more about, okay, we've identified these threats in the threat model. How bad will it be if this asset is impacted? And how can I protect it? So essentially, you're trying to say, I understand I have this risk. How bad is it? And, did I control it sufficiently once I put a control in place? So it is really easy to take a threat model and let it morph into more than it's supposed to be. So my recommendation is you're working threat models and risk management and kind of trying to integrate that. Make a very clean, bright line, what belongs in the threat model and what belongs in the risk management side. When you think about risk management and what the overall risk assessment might look like, one thing that I really like to do with folks is to assign questions to the columns that are in the risk management file. The reason that I think this is helpful is because people get really confused as to what information goes into which of these columns, right? Because vulnerabilities, threat events, they get impacts, they get kind of jumbled up if you don't do this. So if you can, define an asset as, what are we trying to protect in our system? A vulnerability, what kind of weaknesses could allow access to this asset, right? And the threat event is kind of walking through the steps for how that vulnerability could be exploited in the system, right? Impact, what could happen to the asset? Now, when you're looking at this from, without any content in here, it seems like it's pretty straightforward. But once you start trying to enter information into those little cells, you can start to skew pretty quickly. So keeping yourself centered by asking the right questions about what goes in the right box can help keep you on the right track. But this also comes into the point, the reason I show you the kind of the columns is because it's important to understand how do you connect then the information coming out of the threat model with the information that's in the risk management file. And what I'd like to argue here is that I think that, my favorite way to do this is you align and organize, or at least flag your threats in your threat model with assets. And then you can connect those assets to, or connect, the assets with the threats in the risk management file. And so as long as you can describe the threat event that's being described there and the asset, then it's easier to keep that connection of the content that's in the threat model with the content that's in the risk management file. But that can get really confusing really quickly. So the last thing I wanted to talk about here is about traceability, right? It is really important that your threats are tagged. I particularly am a fan because in security, a lot of times you're getting information from various sources, your pen test, your threat model, your vulnerability scans, and trying to use IDs that kind of fall back on the source where you got it. For example, you can number your threat model or your threats TM1, 2, 3, 4. So they're threat model 1, threat model 2, threat model 3. So that when you're looking at your risk assessment, you know that particular line item came out of the threat model, and you can go back and look at where it came from. That can get hard if you don't have the same kind, in my opinion, for what it's worth. Like if you don't do an asset-oriented threat model and an asset-oriented risk management file, it's harder to kind of keep those connections. It's not impossible, but I think approaching them the same way, from the integration work that I have done, I find it easier to do it that way. So, yeah, you'll see that, like, I've called that out in a couple of different places, like in the attack trees too, right? You have attack tree IDs that can be integrated into the different points in the attack trees. So, so thank you very much. We have reserved enough time for a few questions. I know Stephanie is kind of manning the question bucket here, but I did want to just take a moment to just mention a little bit about why we care about this stuff. We help medical device manufacturers in all areas of this space. So we live this space and we breathe this space. And, we want to see people successful, and whether you walk away today and, you have a better understanding of threat modeling, or we talk to you in the future, really, we just want to see this industry get better. And that's what we've dedicated our lives to. So, these are the various things that we do. We work in the technical side of pen testing and threat modeling. I sit more in the regulatory governance and compliance, but we cover all of those aspects. We also work a little bit in the space with MedScan, which is a medical device security risk management product for hospitals for doing passive agentless real-time monitoring of medical devices. We also have those services for the hospitals as well. So I'm going to end with, this is our contact information. We'll do our best to get through as many questions as possible. I'm actually not sure how many we have, but usually these kinds of sessions, we can't get through all the questions, but like Stephanie said, we'll follow up with folks as best we can. And you're also free to reach out to us either through our contact or through the website.
Yeah, so absolutely. So we've got a bunch of questions rolling in, and as Michelle said, anyone that we don't get to live, we will definitely be writing up responses and sending those out to all attendees. So if we didn't get to it, you'll definitely still get the answers to it. So the first one I'm going to throw to you, Michelle, is just how interested is the FDA in cybersecurity risks that don't pose a patient safety risk?
Yeah, that was a good first one. That's actually a really, really good question. And it's very relevant to security because the FDA has actually made a point that when we look at security risks, they're a little different from direct safety risks because so if you look at the impact of a significant security risk that could shut down a hospital, but it's not going to necessarily make your product do anything to harm a patient, but the impact and the level of that security threat is very high because it has the potential to spread quickly. The FDA does consider the fact that even if your product may not directly create patient harm, you still need to look at that larger system, which is why in the beginning of my presentation, I talked about the importance of looking at the full system-wide impact and understanding that. Because even if you can't tell that there could be a health impact, I mean, anyone who watched WannaCry, you know, tear through hospitals and shut hospitals down, and people had to be rerouted to different hospitals, that's a safety impact. But your particular product may have just gotten that red screen of death and just stopped working and not hurt anyone. But the fact that that threat is much higher to the larger system in general is something that the FDA does care about and has mentioned several times when I've been at events where they've been. Hopefully that answers your question.
The one I'll tackle next is just, they're sort of asking about the skills and stakeholders required for the various types of threat modeling. So we talked about threat actor versus asset based and whether or not one needed kind of a different team. So one of the things, if you talk to me, I won't try to hide this, I like threat actor. I won't hide that. The reason I like it is because it doesn't require as technical of a mindset to do. Because remember, threat actor is about asking, you know, what is the threats that somebody might want to do to the system. So they don't have to understand the fact that, okay, well, the CAN bus is an asynchronous protocol, so that means like I potentially inject in here and there's no handshake. That's the kind of stuff that asset-oriented base gets into when you're looking at that very technical assessment of the system and what's possible as a threat. So the asset-oriented base threat models, I find, tend to require more tech-savvy people and people who understand security. Whereas the threat actor based, I find, are a lot more impactful for the broader team. So your software team, your risk team, your systems engineers, your safety risk management team, all of them can sit in a room and say, well, here's bad things that I think a disgruntled nurse might want to do, or here's the things a patient might want to do to the device. Because they understand what the device does, it just might not have the security background to know what's technically feasible. So that's kind of my 2 cents on like basically who is needed, who, if one is more a technical stakeholder on the two. I don't know, Michelle, do you want to add to that?
I think you actually, yeah, I think you actually hit the nail on the head. You know, I think a lot of times the various stakeholders depend on your culture too, right? You know, there are lots of different people play different roles in different spaces, and what you want to get is a good, thorough cross section of functional groups that can lend their thoughts on it. So it looks like we do have one raised hand from Becky. Can we take a live call, or you want to try to do the?
I don't know. We have like 12 other open questions.
Yeah.
Becky, can you write your questions just to make it easier? Sorry about that. But another one I do want to jump into is we have one asking, like, is AMI TIR 57 assessments basically required as a part of submission? So I'll answer that just a little bit, but I know Michelle will have a lot to say on this. So the FDA has never come out and said that TIR 57 is required. It is a consensus document, which means the FDA does like it. And the thing I would say to keep in mind is that FDA had members on the working group that created AMI TIR 57. So I would look at TIR 57 as this was the FDA's way of saying what they would like to see. That's why they participated. That's why they helped build the guidance document. And when they have new reviewers, right, they're training on AMI TIR 57 as this is the type of thing we should be looking for. So it's kind of that universal language that if you're looking for what does the FDA want to see, AMI TIR 57 is a good thing for you to look at to know what are they hoping to see. If you don't do AMI TIR 57, it doesn't mean you won't get through a regulatory submission. It's just, I would say that's the path of least resistance. Michelle, anything to add to that?
Yeah, actually, this has been a hot topic as well. You know, it took a while for, you know, I talk about this topic in TIR 57 a lot. And, you know, it was fairly recently that the FDA in a public forum at a conference that Stephanie and I actually chaired together, did say that just trying to assess security risks through a safety perspective is not enough. And I followed up and talked with him about it later. And basically, you can put all of your risks together, but if you try to use the same measuring stick to measure security as you do safety, you'll never do anything about security because the probability numbers are just not there. And if the severity, like to my point earlier, you know, you can have a pretty significant impact to a hospital, even if, you know, there's not a clear direct relation to safety for your specific product, right? It's a larger system level that you need to think about. And that's what the security measuring sticks or rulers are really important to do, is to make sure that you're measuring those risks in the way that's appropriate to their nature. And the probability of occurrence from 14971 just will typically just run everything from security to an acceptable level. And that's one of the problems with it.
Awesome. And then someone just re-asked about if the slides would be shared. So absolutely, slides and recordings will go out after this event. So the next question I want to tackle is someone's asking if you should analyze threats before or after the application of some of your security controls. So TLS, for example, so encryption of information on the wire. This is one where you'll find there's no right answer, so I will give you my opinion. My opinion is that you should analyze threats before you've applied those security controls. And so the reason I say that is things like TLS, if you have, you know, state-of-the-art encryption on a data stream, when you're looking at that system, you may not pull out all of the threats associated with that data going there, because everyone in their mind knows, well, that's not subject to like tampering, right? It's got full end-to-end encryption. It can't be tampered with. That doesn't work. And so what you'll find is when people are thinking about the security controls and they're drawn in the diagram, you end up missing some of the threats that was controlling. And so why I like to do that is because if you miss that traceability, that opportunity to justify why you're doing things like TLS, and this is just one example, this happens in a multitude of spaces, but then you miss that story that Michelle was talking about. For you to be able to show I had this threat, that threat is now completely acceptable and controlled because I now did this. So you miss the opportunity to tell that story if your base model just says, well, everything's encrypted, so I don't even have any threats on this data stream. Like, it's encrypted and I'm not too worried about it. You miss that opportunity. So you'll see the reviewers come back and say, well, why don't I see risks associated with this? And if your answer is like, well, I already controlled it, they may agree with you that control is strong, but you missed the opportunity to tell them the story. So you got a question, you got a deficiency, which didn't have to be a deficiency if you had simply told the full story in your threat model and in your risk management file to begin with. And so I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we're going to wrap up. We do have a multitude of more questions, so we will get those written up and sent out. The recording will be shared. If everyone is looking for, where it'll be shared, follow Michelle and I on LinkedIn, follow MedSec on LinkedIn. Our main MedSec channel is where we're going to post the recording and the slides. And so please follow us. And Michelle and I absolutely love talking about this. So our email addresses are there. If you guys have questions, we will happily answer them. So everyone have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.